Hello everyone. Today, as you can see by my mini ears, I'm going to be doing a Disney versus original work video because it is Friday. And in case you are not familiar with my channel, basically on Fridays I compare and contrast an original source material that Disney based their feature-length film on. And for the most part, I've been doing all of their animated films. In particular, their 2D animated films, but I will get into Tangled eventually, which will be a CGI film. So, stay tuned for that. But now, at this point in Disney history, since I have been going in order ever since the films came out, so my first video that I made was about Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, which was the first full-length feature animated film. And now I am all the way up to the Hunchback of Notre Dame. In short, people like to say Hunchback, so I might be using that term because the title is just so long, the Hunchback of Notre Dame. But before I dive into this, I'm going to say that it is going to be very difficult for me to make this a short video. When I was doing research, I just kind of went, there's just no way I'm gonna cover this in such a short period of time. So this video might go a little long. It might go a little bit shorter than I think it will, but it is gonna be a little bit long because there is a lot to cover and a lot of interesting stuff actually. I find this work to actually be very in-depth, in particular the original work. So it has a lot to offer, as well as the Disney version too, which really did pull a lot of stuff from it, even though it's still vaguely based on the original work. Because again, the original work offers a lot more characters and such. And that's kind of what I wanted to start this review talking about, is in particular the characters, because the characterizations are somewhat similar and a little bit different, and I thought that it would be cool to sort of explore the characters first before I get into the grit of the plot, which is rather different than the Disney version. So basically, you have your lead female, and in both works her name is Esmeralda, and she is a young gypsy. But the way that the characterizations of these two particular women, the one in the Disney work and the one in the original work, are completely different. The original work plays her out as this very sort of innocent, kind, naive girl. She's almost more of a girl in the original work. She's very vulnerable to the circumstances that she ends up being in, and sort of weak in a sense to stop what's happening to her. So in a way she is very fragile, and I think that often has to do with the age as well, because she is it seems like they play her out in the original work to be fairly young. She is, I think, 16, they say. And I did read the original work, and I believe she was around that age. So she's just in a different state of mind, it seems like. And it seems like that this kind of character is what we would see in a lot of 18th century novels. And in case you don't know who the original work is by, it's by a man named Victor Hugo. And he's also famous for doing Les Miserables too, which is another famous book of his. But for the most part, she seems to be like what a 16-year-old would be during that time period. And probably so in the time period that it takes place in, which is around the 1400s. So again, it's a really different approach, because in the Disney work you'll see how Esmeralda is really strong-willed, and she seems more like in control and stands up to sort of the established order. You'll even see this when she goes up to Quasimodo and frees him at one point. You'll really see that she's a very active character, whereas the one in the Esmeralda in the original work is very passive, and the only thing she offers Quasimodo when he's being tortured is some water. But that small, kind act reflects onto Quasimodo so much that he ends up falling in love with her, and you'll kind of see what ends up happening. And for the most part, the original work as well as the Disney work play up to the idea that everybody wants Esmeralda, which is kind of funny, because you still have Phoebus, you still have Quasi, and you still have Frollo, who still really like her, and I'll sort of explain this as I go on. But it seems like Esmeralda as a character is really focused in both works, and she seems fairly present and a part of the story. It's just these characterizations are rather different. In the original work, she's more of a child, she's a lot younger, and in the Disney work, she seems to have a lot of qualities that resemble sort of women of maybe our time period, and she's a little bit more active, and she feels more like a woman, and avoids these kind of particular flaws of naivete and innocence and weakness. It seems like she's a little bit of a stronger character in the Disney work, at least from the impression that I got after really looking into both of these characters. Now, another character that is also really important that should be addressed, and and out of all the characters that are in the Disney work as well as the original work, it seems like Frollo seems to be the one that is most seems to have the most similar traits in both works, except there are a few little exceptions. Like in the original work, he is an archdeacon, which means he actually holds a position of power within the church. But in the Disney work, he's a judge, and it seems like he has more military kinds of powers, especially with like the guards and all of that stuff. But in the original work, he really doesn't have that power. That power more lies with the king, and you'll actually see in the original work how the king kind of plays a little role in there, and sort of contributes to all of the circumstances that end up happening. But again, he is technically lusty for Esmeralda. It is, I think, portrayed a little bit more in a negative light in both the Disney and the original work. They are playing into the fact that what he is feeling for this woman is kind of, you know, it's wrong in a way, because the church condemns that, and you kind of see in both works how he struggles with this. And I find it interesting that that they decided out of all of the characters to make his character as close as they could to the original work, because it does feel a lot like they were trying to make him this complex, torn apart individual who couldn't control what he feels. So that's pretty much, that character's pretty much played out in a similar way, but there is one distinct difference, in that in the Disney work there's no really mention of jealousy, because in the Disney work Frollo doesn't know that Esmeralda is in love with Phoebus. He never discovers that. There's no indication that he even knew. In the Disney work, all it plays out in the Disney work is the fact that he's dealing with these mixed emotions of having these urges for this woman, and then at the same time having to follow the rules of the church and the church establishment order, and then him suddenly thinking to, in a similar way to the original work too, that she is a witch, and you know she's the problem, you know, and you know, and you kind of see how that ends up playing out sort of in the original work. But for the most part, it seems like that they are similar, except this jealousy aspect, because in the original work, he actually does discover that Phoebus and Esmeralda sort of like each other. And you'll kind of see how this jealousy really actually plays a role more in the plot than it does his kind of religious convictions, really. Even though they are present, it seems like the plot device is really the fact that he's a very jealous man. So that's that aspect that is different, but for the most part the characters are fairly similar. Now, there's also Quasimodo, which again is really part of what the title is, but from the research that I've done and from reading the original work, which has been a long time ago, so I did have to kind of read up again, okay, how did this happen, yada yada, and what happened here. But basically, Quasimodo in the original work is rather, he's not this kind of optimistic, wanting to go out and into the real world and do things. He is rather, I think, content with his position within the church, in that he knows that he couldn't be a part of the real world, and he couldn't be normal. I think that has to do with the fact that in the original work he's not verbal at all. Like, you don't really hear him talk so much, because again there is that isolation that he's had for so many years. So it would kind of make sense that he doesn't really talk so much, and he doesn't really know how to socialize. And not only that, but he's also deaf in the original work because of the bells. The fact that he has to ring these bells all the time, it's made his hearing go bad. So those, I think, physical aspects of him make him a character that knows who he is and kind of just embraces the circumstances that he's in and says, yeah, I mean, I don't really, it doesn't seem like he has a desire to go out into the world and do things. It seems rather that he would just stay within his confines and feel more secure in his confines rather than being out in the world and then everybody criticizes him. So that's really that character within the original work. And not only does the original work play out to the idea that he's a little bit more interested in being isolated, and not having this goal of trying to get out. He seems a little bit more, I would say, at times maybe irrationally violent, and you'll kind of see at one point what I mean by that. And it seems like the Quasimodo in the Disney works a little bit more, like he uses like critical thinking, I think, a little bit more than the Quasi in the original work. But I think that's fairly understandable, considering that Quasi was kept so long in these confinements that he would turn out this way. But the Disney work plays out to, as you can tell from the direction I'm going here with this conversation, that he is so wanting to go out there. The Disney work really plays out to this idea that he is kind of like a princess. He wants to, go out in the world and be part of the people and be one and, be accepted for who he is, and he really wants that, and it's really emphasized in this story that he's like, I want to get out there and I want to experience things. But in the original work, it's just not like that. There is no mention of this kind of goal that he has. It's more based on his relationships with the other characters that makes him kind of who he ends up becoming. So really, I think that Disney was trying to make it, again, a little bit more lighthearted, instead of making it this really dark story, because, again, they were basing this work off of a source material that is very, very dark. So bringing out this, I think, lightheartedness and wanting to actually go out into the world, I think works for Disney. And it wouldn't have worked for the original source material, but I think as far as Disney goes, they did, I think, a good job of emphasizing this point on how Quasi wants to go out into the world and wants to be a part of the people and doesn't want to be locked up and throughout his entire life. So really that's the big main difference between these two characters. Now there's also some characters added in here in the original work that were not in the Disney work at all. One of these characters in particular is named John Frollo, and John Frollo is actually Cloud Frollo's brother. And you'll kind of see how their relationship is in the original work. John Frollo is basically like, he's pretty much a bum in that he doesn't really seem to have any goals or aspirations with his life. He just kind of wants to get a free ride from his brother, and he does this by like asking him for money, you know, like, please, I'm desperate, I need some money, and then he goes off and he spends it on things like alcohol. So he is kind of, I hate to put the term like that he's a loser, but he is played off as this guy who really doesn't have a direction in his life, who really doesn't want to contribute anything to society, and so much as only cares about himself and his own needs and what he wants to do. And you'll kind of see this relationship play out in the original work, and it's kind of interesting because of how Cloud Frollo is trying to sort of deal with this. Like, he's, you know, supposed to have a high position in the church, he's supposed to be very moral, and the fact that his brother is just done so much immoral behavior, it's hard for him to deal with it. So you'll kind of see that relationship play out a little bit in the original work if you choose to read it. It really, I don't think, adds much to the story, but it may have added a little bit to Cloud Frollo's character. But it was just another character that, for some reason, Disney was just like, nah, that guy's not really necessary, and I can kind of see why. But he is there. There's also Phoebus, who is in both works. Phoebus is technically, they call him the captain of the guard in the Disney work, but in the original work, he's called the captain of the archers. Of the King's Archers, excuse me. And basically, it's really hard to tell with this character and his motivations. It seems like that he's just trying to use Esmeralda to, you know, get what he wants. In the original work, it does seem like that he is just this dashing hero who thinks he's, you know, all that, and it doesn't come off as so genuine of a character. But in the Disney work, he's completely different. Like, he seems rather genuine, and I find it interesting that that his first encounter with Esmeralda when they're in the church is sort of like a fight, like they're playing combat or something. But in the original work, it's a lot different in that he's sort of her hero, he's her savior. You know, it's more that traditional romance, whereas in the Disney work, it's designed to be more, again, of our time period. It's not designed to be like how it was way back when, which you kind of think is odd, but at the same time, I think I understand why Disney did this. They kind of knew they had to update the fairy tale, they had to update romance and such. But in the original work, it's fairly traditional in that he saves her at one point, and you'll kind of see as I'm going through when I'm explaining the difference between the plots, you'll understand how she becomes infatuated with him, and but that's basically his character in a nutshell. And he is actually, even though he does supposedly like Esmeralda, or love, or however you want to term it, Esmeralda, he still is betrothed to somebody else, and in the original work. And this lady is named Filet de Les de Golendarier. I'm probably pronouncing that incorrectly, but she's kind of mean. She kind of notices that Phoebus likes Esmeralda, and she kind of there's certain points where she tries to be kind of rude, and so there is that kind of jealousy again going on with her character. There's also in the original work this struggling poet named Pierre Grinogire, and he actually in the beginning ends up marrying Esmeralda, and as I'm going through the plot, you'll kind of understand the reasons that led up to that. But he sort of plays a role in again the plot, and he is sort of used as a plot device character. So I will try to explain that once I talk about the plot. But really, all you need to know of him as a character is that he's a struggling poet. Really, that's all that there is to him. There's also Sister Gudul, and she happens to end up being Esmeralda's mother, and you'll kind of see how that plays out in the plot. Again, it's one of those characters where you feel like when they were playing it out in the novel, oh, it's sort of touching, because of the circumstances that both these characters are in. So it is kind of, I think, again, her character's more used as a plot device to get our emotions sort of rallied up, and so that's really her character for the most part. And then there's also Louis the Sixth, or no, excuse me, Louis the 11th, who basically is responsible for ordering the execution of Esmeralda. It's not like Judge Cloud Frollo in the Disney work, who has this power to say, hey, you know what, she's a witch, she should be burned. In the original work, it's Louis the 11th who orders her to be executed, because what ended up resulting from, when I explain in the plot, really comes down to the fact that a lot of people in Paris have riled up about these rumors about her and have decided, yeah, she's a witch, she should die, she should burn. So it was almost like the king was like, okay, I'm really doing the wishes of the people. So it was more, I think, that aspect than him just saying, oh, she is a witch, yeah, she should die. It was more based upon all of the other people sort of rallying up and saying, burn her, So that's really his character, and he doesn't really contribute much other than, again, plot device. But it does allow the movie to, or the book to move forward. And finally, I'll briefly discuss a character that is in both the Disney work as well as the original work, and that is Chopin. And basically, he's the king of trolls, and the king of trolls are like criminals, basically. And you'll see how he rallies the Court of Miracles. And there's at one point in the Disney version where there's a song about the Court of Miracles and how Phoebus and Quasimodo end up getting captured, and this place called the Court of Miracles, is suspicious of them and thinks that they'll tell somebody about this place. So they figure, oh, I guess we should, you know, execute them. So you'll kind of see how that particular aspect is played out. But the Court of Miracles is played out rather different in the original work, in that basically the Court of Miracles is all of these criminals, and basically Schloppen rallies all of these people within the Court of Miracles to go save Esmeralda at one point. I don't really know. I think it has to do with the fact that I think Esmeralda is intended to be sort of part of this circle of people that create this Court of Miracles, so it does make sense that they would want to protect her. So they try to go all together and rally up and see if they can save her. So, because they know that at one point she's being held in the cathedral, and I'll explain that once the plot is explained. But that's really all you have to understand about these characters, is that there's these various different little things that make them unique to each work. But there are things within the circumstances of the plot that make these works take different directions at times. So with the original work's opening of the plot, basically it starts off with Quasimodo being elected as the Pope of Fools. That's what they end up calling it. In the Disney work, it's called the King of Fools and not the Pope. But basically the whole Paris mob, I guess you could say, rallies him up as the Pope of Fools because they think he, again, is the ugliest person. But in the Disney work, we get a little, we have a chance to go a little bit further back in time, in that it starts off with Chaplin sort of being the narrator here and explaining to the audience about what ended up happening to Quasimodo and the way beginning stages of his life and how he ended up in the cathedral. And basically how it plays out is that it plays out that Quasimodo's mom was a gypsy trying to go somewhere, and Frollo ends up realizing that discovering her and these other gypsies, I think, because she's with more than just herself and the baby, which is Quasimodo. And you'll see how Frollo assumes that she stole something, and she's kind of scared for her life, so she runs, and then Frollo's chasing her. And then you'll see how he tries to take the baby from her, even though he doesn't know it's a baby. He thinks it's like some stolen goods or something. And then he basically like kicks his foot almost like in her face, and then she just falls flat onto the stairs of the Notre Dame, because she goes to the church to find some sanctuary, and he ends up basically just killing her. And he doesn't really seem guilty of this. It seems like he goes, you know, what was I supposed to do? You know, she gave off the idea that she was a criminal. You know, she ran, I pursued. You know, that kind of mentality he had. Even though he ended up killing somebody. But then he realizes it's a baby, and then he realizes, oh, it's an ugly baby, so I should kill it. And the archdeacon stops him and says, heck, you look at what you did. You know, you need to go, you know, raise, you know, this baby on your own now, because, you know, you need to repay for what you did. And then Frollo at first is like, psh, why should I do that? And then he kind of goes, oh, because I might go to hell. Okay, alright, I'll raise this baby. So that's basically how the Disney work plays out in the way beginning. You get none of this in the original work at all. It just starts completely from Quasimodo being elected the Pope of Fools. And as the Disney work sort of continues, you realize how Quasimodo kind of ends up there by mistake. Because it seems like nobody's really, well, maybe some people are aware that he is there in the tower, but it almost seems like he, just out of his curiosity, and you know, him being a Disney character, he wants to go out, and he ends up being discovered, and people think that he's Esmeralda originally, when she encounters him, thinks that he's wearing a fake mask, but then realizes, oh, that's his actual face. And then that's kind of how he's elected the King of Fools. But basically in the original work, it just starts off with the Pope of Fools, him being crowned as like the Pope of Fools. And after sort of this celebration, or during this celebration, we see, because it is kind of treated as like this big festival, Frollo ends up discovering Esmeralda, and he's in the original work, and he's kind of like, okay, I want that. And then he kind of tells Quasimodo, hey, can you go get her for me? And, you know, being Quasimodo, having established this, because again, in the original work it is established that, you know, that Frollo is Quasimodo's master, and that, you know, he's supposed to follow his orders and do whatever he tells him to do, because he thinks that that's always going to be the right thing. So Frollo basically says, yeah, can you please capture her for me? And Quasimodo complies and says, sure, I'll do that for you. And he ends up trying to capture her, but at the same time, this is where we get introduced to Phoebus in the original work, where he and his guards actually end up saving Esmeralda from Quasimodo. Disney work way different. Once Quasimodo goes out to meet the people and is crowned the King of Fools, people suddenly just start turning on him. It's kind of odd how it's played out in the Disney work, but basically they just turn on him, and then that's how the torturing starts, and where he's tied to the pivory. And in case you don't know what a pivory is, it's like a turning wheel, and it was supposed to be really a horrible sort of torturing device. But in the Disney work, it's just played out, they tie him to sort of the pivory and just like spin him around, and then people throw stuff at him, and it's rather odd because they, at one point they're like, yeah, this is so cool, we found like the ugliest person in Paris, this is great. And then they're like, ooh, he's ugly, we should just throw stuff at him. So in the Disney work, it's really like they just turn on him just because of his looks. But really what Quasimodo did in the original work was a crime. I mean, he tried to capture a woman against her will. So after Phoebus and his guards discover this, they're like, yeah, this guy should be punished for what he did. And then, so basically in the original work, he's sentenced to be flogged and turned on the pillory again, that wheel. And then he's supposed to be shamed in the public and scorned by the public, because again, that was sort of a part of like a lot of medieval torture. It wasn't just about like hurting somebody physically, it was supposed to break down their emotions too when they're humiliated in front of everybody. So that's what his punishment ends up actually getting him to be punished. But in the Disney work, it's almost played out that, you know, Quasi's the victim here. But in the original work, it seems like that, yeah, he did something wrong, so we should punish him for it. even though it really wasn't his fault, because again, he is being manipulated by Frollo. So there is that aspect to it. And at one point during the time they are torturing him in the original work, Esmeralda steps up, and at one point he's asking for water, and she basically gives him some water. Just a little small act of kindness. In the Disney work, as he's being publicly humiliated and scorned at, Esmeralda looks at this and goes, in the Disney work, I'm not gonna let them do this. So she kind of just goes up to where he is, and at one point she takes like her dress and tries to clean him off, because I guess they were throwing like vegetables and stuff at him. And then Cloud Frollo was kind of like, hey, stop that woman, you know, because at the same time he kind of wants to see Quasimodo punished for disobeying him, because originally Cloud Frollo does not want Quasimodo going out into the real world in the Disney work. So you really see how that plays out. But for the most part, she does seem to be more active than just giving him some water. She actually stands up to Cloud Frollo and says, hey, you know, this is cruel, this is wrong, and you know, you should, you know, there should be justice here, and you know, she's really an active character. But in the original work, she just gives him some water. But that water, that little kind act, means so much to Quasi that he ends up falling deeply in love with her after that. Just that little small thing of giving him water makes him completely head over heels for her, because nobody has been kind to him. So he really sees this as a real, genuine act of kindness, and he's just so taken aback by it that he ends up falling in love with her as a result. In the Disney work, it sort of played out that they have this friendship established before Quasi starts falling for her, and you'll kind of see that in the Disney work. But for the most part, in the original work, they really like to play out the more of the love at first sight, the love of, you know, you see somebody do something kind for you, and then all of a sudden it's like it means the world to you. So again, it is really these two different approaches, I think, that what make this particular story unique. But after basically in the original work she gives him some water, there is some time that passes, but throughout that time Esmeralda is really trying to sort of win the heart of Phoebus, and then Judge Frollo's kind of looking up in the tower like, I don't like this at all. And so at one point in the original work, he sees Phoebus and Esmeralda together and ends up following them, and basically I think they end up in a room somewhere, and he basically, I guess, has a knife with him, and he, in the original work, ends up stabbing Phoebus. In the Disney work, none of that happens, because again, there's no establishment of jealousy. Frollo doesn't know that Esmeralda ends up developing feelings for Phoebus. There's no need for him to act out in a jealous manner if he doesn't know. So Disney, I think, just decided to completely scrap that and just go in a completely kind of different direction from there. But at the same time still bringing in aspects that were in the original work, which I will explain as I continue. But basically in the original work, after Phoebus is stabbed, Esmeralda ends up getting blamed for it. And then she's charged basically for attempted murder, and then they all think that she's a witch. And while she's basically in jail, Frollo comes to her, and this is where he does sort of the big reveal, like, I love you, you know, please be with me. This is where he really goes in on the deep end here, and he kind of asks her, please take pity on me, you know, I'm just a man, I'm sorry. Like, and she's just like, please get out of my sight, just go away. So there's that encounter that happens. Whereas in the Disney work, we don't see this encounter until later on. And then, but there is this kind of establishment that Frollo is really a jerk for her, and he is really lusting for her. But he doesn't ultimately reveal, like, hey, you know, want to be with me? Like, doesn't openly say that until a while later. But it's already established here, even when she's in jail, that he wants to confess this to her, because I think at this point he thinks that, you know, I'm sort of her savior, you know, I'm her only hope that she's got. And basically she's sentenced to hang. And also what you need to understand about the original work is that she is tortured too, like repeatedly tortured. Like they almost want to make her confess a lie. Like literally it's so sad, it's so bad. Not bad in a sense like, oh, this makes the novel bad, but it's really tragic. Like, it's just, you really feel like, oh my lord, like, what are they doing to this woman? Do they really want her to confess to something that she didn't do? So basically she ends up false confessing and saying, yes, I did it, yeah, I'm a witch. And then they say, okay, well, we're gonna hang you now. Thank you for confessing. And then what ends up happening is that we get the famous sanctuary scene. And it's played out similarly to the Disney version as well, except in the Disney version, Frollo ends up revealing his love for her, sort of like, hey, choose me, or I'm gonna burn you, like, alive. Like, basically that's what he says. At least this Frollo's maybe a little bit more subtle by just coming into the jail and saying, hey, I love you, do you want me? But in this version, in the Disney version, he's like, choose me, or you get the burning. So, but it seems like in the Disney work, they wanted to burn her, but in the original work, it's just, they just want to hang her, send her to the gallows, basically. But Quasi ends up saving her, and he kind of has, I guess he knew about the fact that she was being accused and was going to be executed, so he sort of planned this thing out, where he would take the bell ropes and then swing down and be sort of Tarzan and save the day. But in the Disney work, it's played out a little bit different in that he is chained literally to the pillars, like these stone pillars, and then he uses the bells ringing and he uses his strength to, like, break the chains and then go down and save her, because I guess Frollo knows that he would try to attempt to save her, so he decides in the Disney work, yeah, we're tying you up now, you know, I know that you're on her side, so he just basically ends up tying him up, and then he ends up being free and then saving her. But in the original work, he just had a whole strategy planned out and was like, okay, I'm gonna execute this plan. And so basically he just uses a rope and he ends up going to save her. and he actually ends up claiming sanctuary. You know, it's that similar epic feel in both works where he's like, sanctuary, and like lifts her up and says, sanctuary, you know, you can't touch her now, she's in a church now. So he basically keeps her in that church for a little while, and they sort of develop this so quasi friendship, and he's oftentimes very shy but very kind to her, and treats her with respect and care. So he is rather a loving figure, even though he has this really tough, brooding aspect to his personality. So you really do get the sense that Esmeralda appreciates it, but deep down she just can't love him, and it's kind of sad. It's more of, and it's interesting to see them kind of actually interact more for the first time, whereas in the Disney work it's already established that they are friends, that they've had interacted before, because she does come into the cathedral and claim sanctuary early on, when she was calling out Frollo for who he was in the beginning. But in the original work, it's not until up to this point where we get a really true relationship between the two characters. But that's basically that. Now what ends up happening is that even though she claims sanctuary, or quasi-technically claims sanctuary for her, the Court of Parliament in France decides that she is voted to be removed from this right to sanctuary within the church, and that she needs to be taken out and receive the justice that they think that she deserves, even though she didn't really do anything. And you know, it really does in the original really emphasize the point of like government corruption, and how a lot of the times torture was used as a way to get people to reveal things that maybe actually weren't even true at all. People just wanted the torture to stop. So it does kind of make sense that there is this sort of corruption within government, and that was really closely knit to the church during the time, which is where you get the whole accusation of witchcraft and such. So that's established. And basically Grigore, the struggling poet that I mentioned earlier, he ends up telling this to Chopin in the original work, that, hey, you know what, she's actually not that safe, maybe we should go and help her out. And Chopin's like, yes, to the cathedral, and then they all go and try to save her. But what ends up happening is that Quasi mistakes them for people who are trying to attack Esmeralda, because again he is trying to be this protector, and he ends up killing a lot of the people that end up really wanting to save her. So that's kind of a bummer, but it does end up happening. So again, this is where I think I've established too that this Quasi is a little bit more, he doesn't really know how to really interact with people and just say, and just try to talk with someone and just say, hey, what are you doing? Where are you going? What are you trying to do? You know, but instead he just kind of takes out his brawn and just says, hey, you know what, don't you dare try going near her. I don't care if you're trying to save her. Don't go near. But he just mistakes it for them trying to attack her, and he basically ends up killing a lot of those people. But ultimately Esmeralda does end up being captured by the king's guards, and then basically This is where Frollo is kind of pleading again. And this one, it's maybe a little bit more forceful, like it was in the Disney work where he's holding up the flame door and saying, you know, choose me or the fire, you know. In this part, he asks her to love him or be hanged. And she's kind of like, I'd rather be hanged than be with you. And in a similar way to like the Disney work where she just kind of spits at him and says, you know what, forget you, you know, I'd rather be hanged or rather be burned, which again, Disney work, they wanted to burn her. In the original work, they wanted to hang her. So basically, during this time, as to the point where she's going to be executed or attempted to be executed again, she actually ends up discovering her mom, and this is where the sister Gludel comes in, and they have sort of this little touching moment. And again, the relationship is supposed to like sort of hype the drama, and that, oh, they've never seen each other, you know, it's been such a long time. And then because the mom thought earlier on that she was dead, and then she goes, oh, you're alive, and you know, it's like that emotional stir up that the audience will get from having that character in, because you feel so sympathetic to Esmeralda's circumstances. So it's touching. It's sad that they could only have that one time, and then she's sent off to the gallows again. And then as Esmeralda, and then Quasi suddenly discovers, like, oh no, she's not here, and then realizes that they basically killed her. He ends up being really devastated, and he just basically in the original just cries out like, no, like, why? And he just sees her like just hanging there, like basically dead, and hanging like on the gallows. And this is the point where Frollo's doing kind of his evil laugh, like, ha ha ha, I got rid of my lust now, ha 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 ha, you know. And Quasi sees this and goes, oh no, you're going down. And so he basically he grabs Frollo and he just kind of pushes him off the cathedral, and that's how he ends up dying. In the Disney work, it's kind of by his own hand and by his own sheer craziness, and I'll kind of explain the Disney work a little bit more. But I wanted to touch again on the original work so that you kind of understand more of what's going on there, and how I will try to explain how it's different in the Disney work. But basically, after basically the antagonist is defeated and Esmeralda is hanged, basically, Quasi is completely overly devastated, and he ends up going to the vaults of the Guildtech of Montagnon, which is a place where they basically put her body, just not really like a proper burial, like, yeah, or you're basically filth. So that's where they put her body, and Quasimodo decides to go find where her corpse is, and he basically sits next to her, and I think at one point it's established that they are holding hands, and he basically sits there until he dies, pretty much. He's so overridden with grief, so over traumatized, that he just decides to basically starve himself out of grief. So he just sits there and waits until he dies. And then a year later, after Quasi has been pretty much dead for a while, I think it's like 18 months, they say, these people discover their bodies, and as the person is trying to sort of separate them, the two basically corpses, his it's established that his bones sort of turn into dust, sort of like, yeah, this is the end, you know, this is you know, sort of like saying, yeah, what's done is done, and you know, it's their characters are basically dust in the wind now. They're not, the contributions to what society gave them was nothing, and so they in turn suffered sort of this kind of fate. And it's sad, it's really sad, but that's really how the original work is pretty much played out. And then Phoebus still ends up marrying that one chick or whatever, and he doesn't really end up remembering Esmeralda. I think at one point even his supposed wife says, "Oh yeah, she's dead." No, they like they executed her. So it really isn't established whether or not he even has feelings for her anymore. It was almost like he was similar to Frollo in that they sort of more lusted for her rather than really genuinely loved her. Whereas Quasi, you could really tell it was a genuine love. So I think that was really what a lot of the original work was trying to establish. Now, as far as the Disney work goes, what I mean by going it off into completely different directions is the characters that they bring into. In particular, I'm talking about the gargoyles. There are no gargoyles in the original work. There are no gargoyles who talk to Quasimodo. No. No, Hugo wasn't that egotistical, like, I'm gonna name one of those gargoyles Hugo, and I'm gonna name one of them Victor, ha ha ha. No, this was Disney deciding to say, hey, you know what, maybe we should pay tribute to the guy who actually wrote the original source material, so let's put in gargoyles that talk to Quasimodo, so it's kid friendly. And yeah, these gargoyles are kind of obnoxious. But regardless of what you feel about the gargoyles, doesn't matter. They're in the Disney work, and it's clearly established that they play a role. During the climax, when Esmeralda is being sort of burned at the stake, and all these people are really surrounding her, it's established that these gargoyles are real, and what basically ends up happening is as Quasimodo is taking her away, sort of a riot breaks out, because Phoebus is captured, because again, he does have feelings for Esmeralda, and he does seem to have more of a genuine love for her in the Disney work. So he ends up being captured, but by Quasimodo saving Esmeralda, they're able to be released, and then they basically fight with Frollo's guards, and then this all kind of leads up to the climax, and Frollo's really mad that Esmeralda escaped, so he goes up and tries to find her and Quasi, and you know, he does the whole sanctuary thing, Quasimodo raising the roof, going sanctuary, and basically when Frollo goes up, he just becomes this really crazed, like, just I don't want to say he's over the top, but he comes off sometimes that way, and just the fact that how crazy he is. But at one point, once Quasi saves her, he thinks that she's dead because she's not waking up. But she eventually wakes up. Again, this is Disney again, sort of playing with our emotions that way. She ends up waking up. She doesn't end up dying. What ends up happening is that Frollo ends up coming up to them and tries to kill Quasimodo, but there's this whole fight between him and Quasimodo sort of in the climax, and sort of Esmeralda, but Esmeralda's sort of played as the damsel here, and who's probably rather weak from dealing with the fumes of the fire that she had to deal with previously when she was almost about to be burned alive. But basically, it's this whole big climactic fight between him and Quasi, and he sort of ends up leading to his own downfall, instead of in the original work where Quasi really takes the initiative and says, "Screw you." In the original work, but in the Disney work, he kind of, he ends up being on one of the gargoyles, or one of the little, they're like basically fighting where the outside of the cathedral is, by where all these gargoyle heads are, and basically Frollo's about to finish them off, and then out of his own sheer stupidity, he looks down and says, "Oh, it's kind of breaking here." Like it's established that the fumes from the flames of them trying to burn her somehow makes the stones weak. I don't know what Disney was really going for, but basically he ends up trying to basically kill them both, but out of his own sheer sheer kind of stupidity and almost his scared nature, because again there's this whole establishment that he is really freaked out of, like, about going to hell and stuff. He ends up holding onto the gargoyle, and then the gargoyle just kind of looks at him and like comes kind of sort of alive and is like, "Ha ha ha, who's going to hell now?" And he basically, and then it just basically breaks off and then makes him plunge into like the fire that's at the bottom surrounding the cathedral. So that's really how the Disney work plays itself out. I find it funny in how kind of over the top it is, but for the most part I think it is played out in an interesting way. It does feel like that Disney was trying to make this a Disney-like movie, but still make some of these little more, but try to make these darker aspects to it. And even though Quasi in the beginning sort of understands, because Quasi never, I don't think, knows really that Phoebus likes Esmeralda in the original work, but in the Disney work it is established that he ends up realizing that Esmeralda really likes him and not Quasi. So he decides, Quasimodo ends up deciding, you know what, they should be together, you know, and sort of at the end you'll see how in the Disney version he tries to put their hands together, and in the end she doesn't die, you know, she and Phoebus end up being together. Quasi ends up going into the real world, and that's really the end of the Disney version. So two completely different ways of telling the story, but I think in both cases it works. It's just Hugo wanted to tell it as more of a tragedy, and Disney wanted to tell it as more of a hopeful rise from all of the corruption that was going on. But in the original work it was focusing in on how that corruption is damaging to us as a society, and that sometimes people may not survive it, and people like Esmeralda and Quasi were those kinds of people. But in the Disney work it's trying to establish that eventually good will overcome, and that Quasi and Esmeralda and all of those who fight for decency and goodness can eventually overcome such difficult times. So really that's how these two works really play out. It was really, I am like at over an hour now. I am totally sorry, but there was just no way I was going to be able to do this under an hour. Just no way, because there was just way too much to cover. But I think it's interesting if I can continue on talking maybe a little bit longer than usual, because it gives the audience a little bit more of an understanding of what these two works are and what factors ended up leading to it being this way in the original work and what ended up it being this way in the Disney work. So I think they're both interesting works. I would definitely check out the original one too, actually reading it if you're interested, because it does have a lot of aspects to it that are maybe a little bit more in depth and more maybe complex than the Disney work. But at the same time, they're both good and they offer a unique take on this story. So, but yeah, I think that's really all I can say. I am going to have to look and see what the next Disney vs. Original Work Friday will be, but I'll be sure to let everybody know once I know. But yeah, I think that's really all I can say about them. But any questions, comments, concerns, I'd be more than happy to answer them. I know there were some people who were hyped for this particular one, and I hope it tried to at least satisfy it. But I think that's really all I can say. But thank you so much for watching, and have a nice day, and bye-bye.